Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Something I've been meaning to emphasize as we've gone along here, and it's hard because there's so much material in this book, and the more I've read it, the more I know I've said before, like, I realize this is a big book and it's a commitment, but I really think we all should read this. So if you feel like this has been interesting, I assure you the book is even more interesting. It's also challenging at times, and it goes into great granular detail that we don't have time to go into here. But if you hear something that's intriguing to you, I really do encourage you to turn to the book. But one of the things that's part of the paradox of all of this, and is part of, I think, Taylor's project in describing what it means to live and have faith in a secular age, we have to remember that we benefit tremendously from living in a secular age. The point of this is not an exercise in, look how terrible the world has turned, and we're the Orthodox, and we're bearing the flag of faithfulness and truth. The reality is we benefit tremendously from living in a world that has been secularized. We have the freedom to be Orthodox in a land that has never been Orthodox. That alone, in historical perspective, is really, really crucial, because the whole point about the shift from the pre-modern era into the modern era was a shift in what it meant to be faithful in your land amongst your people. And most places in history, there was one religion or one main religion that everyone had to participate in. You could participate in other little things if you wanted to, but there was a main thing that you were required to do, because they associated religion and the practice of religion with civilization. We'll see this more tonight, with the sustaining of civilization. So if you didn't participate in it, you were an enemy of the state. We live in a land with the Enlightenment and modernist value of the tolerance of religion, and so we benefit from that. Most of us, or many of us at least, whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who were immigrants to this land, came to America precisely for human flourishing. They could have, my great-grandparents could have stayed in the mountains of the Carpathian Mountains of Slovakia and lived as peasant farmers and passed that on to generation. And the reason they came to America was to have a better flourishing in this world, right? And as we've been seeing, that is a crucial aspect of what we mean by a secular age. It is the muting or diminishing of the vertical, transcendent aspect of life and meaning, the calling to something beyond human flourishing, and the imminence of only thinking that our life is about human flourishing. But we all benefit from the human flourishing that world has created. I could pop over here and turn on our central heat. I didn't have to fire up a wood furnace or there's so many things that we benefit from. So all of that is to say we have to be careful what we're talking about here. This isn't a sort of let's pile on to what's wrong with the world, and thankfully we're what's right with the world, and all of these things that have happened since the late Middle Ages to today are just horrible, horrible things. They have ushered in tremendous benefits, and we benefit from those benefits. But we also then create different pressures of what it means to live our life of faith in this particular world, particularly, as I've said before, because orthodoxy is thoroughly pre-modern and has never modernized in our thought patterns. It has never modernized in our liturgical patterns. It has never modernized in our ascetical spiritual expectations of one another. All of that is the same, right? So we have additional challenges, but also additional opportunities, because the world has caught on that we've taken a few wrong turns along the way, and people are beginning to suffer. They're suffering spiritually. They're suffering in terms of their internal life. And they're in their eternal life perhaps as well, but in their internal life, they're longing for something that orthodoxy alone seems to be the thing that has emerged that says, here's what you're looking for, right? It's precisely our stubbornness, if you will. It's not really stubbornness, our faithfulness of saying, we're not going to simply reinvent Christianity every time a new invention comes along or any time a new trend comes along. We are going to live the faith of our fathers. We're going to live the faith of the Holy Mothers, the saints from every generation. That is the crucial aspect of what we mean by the word orthodoxia. So we're in a crucial place. We have additional pressures, but also amazing opportunities. We are going towards the end here for Charles Taylor, although we won't be leaving Charles Taylor behind. We have tonight and next week, and then we're probably going to take a week or so to let me transition into Ian McGilchrist and the Matter with Things, which is going to be a different way of looking at the similar phenomena, but from this perspective, not a cultural history, but instead a understanding of how the brain works and what it means to understand how the brain works, what it means to attend to the world in a particular perspective, and how that changes what we see and what we think we know. So we will be bringing Charles Taylor into that conversation. The idea is not to leave one, switch gears, and go to another. The idea is to layer something else from a totally different angle on top and keep on pulling Charles Taylor in, okay? So that's where we're going. So we're in really part 5 of A Secular Age, and here there's sort of an acknowledgement that one aspect of what it means to live in a secular age is the decline in religious practice. Those are essentially the facts on the grounds, although we don't see a sharp decline in religious practice really until about the 1970s. That's when the bottom begins to fall out, and there's a sort of mass exodus of church attendance. The time that church attendance takes a sharp turn or a change, at least in Western culture, is sometime in the 70s. In Europe, much before that, of course. They had 2 world wars on their soil, so they were responding to different things as well. But at least from our perspective, our part of the story, the 1970s, there's a decline in religious practice. And as Taylor freely acknowledges, sometimes we have to define what we think we mean by religion. If religion, we mean the traditional faith of Christianity and its practices, there has clearly been a decline in religious practice. If by religion we mean interests in ultimate things or spirituality, then it's alive and well all around us, but in a great plurality of forms and ideas, right? So we're still dealing with reality. We're not painting a clear linear picture where first one thing happens and then other things. These are all streams that are happening. But one of the things he talks about is the idea of an unthought. An unthought. And by unthought, he means a sort of temper or outlook underlying how you approach the world and how you think about the world. And what he's after here with the unthought is to try to identify, we've spent the last 4 weeks talking about the way that the world was shifting, the relationship of the church in the West, particularly in Northern Europe, England, and America and Canada is the world we're really talking about here. But the West, the way that the relationship of faith shifts in its relationship to the state, in its relationship to citizenship and economics and philosophy and all those sorts of things. And what happens is now our temperament has changed. And this is what Taylor calls an unthought. And a great example of this is to just think about someone like Francis of Assisi. Remember, if you don't know of Francis of Assisi, a saint obviously of the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church. He's not a saint of the Orthodox Church. But if you recall, maybe you saw Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Anybody? Great movie, by the way. There have been many films of Francis of Assisi. Francis was the son of a very wealthy merchant. And if he was just a good boy, he would also become a very wealthy merchant, and he would enjoy wealth, and he would enjoy comfort, and he would take his place in his family's business and occupy a strata of society that was very enviable. But of course, he instead has a spiritual awakening. He rejects all of that. And very famously, when his father and the local priest challenge him about everything that's been given to him, and who does he think he is to begin living this sort of monastic life, he strips, he takes all his clothes off, and he says, if my father has given me anything, I return it. And he walks naked out of the village and he goes barefoot everywhere, and he lives this, really, everyone thought he was a complete nut. And I think that the Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon film, which is kind of hippie, I mean, it is a kind of hippie take on Francis of Assisi, but it captures very well just how radical what he does is. But for many people, Francis has been, over the centuries, a great inspiration on accepting the call to the transcendent, to that which transcends human flourishing, to lay aside wealth and respectability and get married and have kids and live in your family mansion, and be powerful and have privilege. He lays that all aside, and he serves the poor, and he lives a life of incredible poverty by voluntary choice. This is a great example of self-denial in a beautiful way. Then, however, there's Hume, David Hume, the Enlightenment thinker, who calls him a practitioner of senseless self-denial and a threat to civil mutuality. Right? This is what Taylor is after with this idea of unthought and temperament. When you look at someone like Francis, what do you instantly think? Do you think, wow, hero of the faith, living for the Lord, willing to sacrifice all the comforts of life in order to be faithful? Or do you think, this guy's a lunatic, he should have just taken the food and the clothes and all the privilege? Or more, Hume saw him as a threat to civil order because he's stepping outside the bounds of what's expected of him for religious enthusiasm and to a certain temperament and unthought. That's really not okay. Like, that's embarrassing. You shouldn't do that. Consider a more modern example of this with Christopher Hitchens, the rather famous atheist. He's one of the new atheists who's written very belligerently against really all faith. I mean, he's not just against Christianity. He's against any form of transcendental belief or religion. And he actually wrote a book on how awful Mother Teresa is and how she's a threat to civilization, right? Because to a certain unthought, the idea that you could forego something like sexual pleasure for the sake of a higher calling is threatening. It's a sign of mental illness. Why would you do that? You're potentially showing other people a false way, right? This is what Taylor calls the unthought. Tell me what you think about Francis, and I'll tell you what your unthought is. And as Orthodox Christians, we can do this with any number of our saints. We can look at our saints, of course, who lived extraordinary lives of self-denial and asceticism, at times almost hard to fathom, and recognize in ourselves, like, what am I taking away from that? Do I read about our saints and some of the ascetical things that they do and think, wow, this guy had a few screws loose, right? Because I know I would never want to live that way, and not only do I not find it inspiring that he lived that way, but I just think the whole thing is sick, right? That's your unthought. So if you've ever had that response to the saints, and I know many of us have, when I encourage us to read spiritual literature, spiritual fathers, I am well aware that for some folks, they read about, let's take St. Simeon the Stylite, a man who lives on a pole, on a pillar, for decades, and is, in a sense, a spectacle. I don't think we have any Stylites in our church, do we? I should have looked before I asked that question. I don't see any, but in Georgia, we actually visited monasteries that still have Stylite towers standing. you can see where stylites actually lived. It's more like in a narrow tower with really rickety stairs or a ladder that go up to the top and they won't let you go. You know, they're roped off now because they're not safe. But it's still a living tradition over there because you can see where stylites live. But to forego any other aspect of life and live exposed to the elements, or maybe in just a tiny little room at the top of a small, narrow tower, have your food roped up to you, and you're just up there praying and making prostrations all day, is that a sign of mental illness, or is that an inspiration of, gee, my own prayer rule is much more modest, but at least I'm inspired to give more to it by looking at St. Simeon the Stylite? So this is an example of an unthought. Do we struggle to appreciate sanctity when sanctity challenges our own idea of what's normal, or what it means to flourish as a human being? Or the great question of philosophy, what is the good life? Is the good life doing nothing but praying on a pillar? Or is it something else, something that we have taken to ourselves with our own collection of unthoughts about it? This is just the way normal life is, and thank God we're all normal, right? So what Taylor is identifying here is that there's an unthought to the secular two worldview. Now remember, the secular two, there's three forms of secularity. Secular two is the first stage, and it's associated with the beginnings of modernity and the Enlightenment, where we essentially expel God from the marketplace, from the public square. We separate church and state. We put religion in its place. It's fine if you would like to have that for you, but it doesn't infiltrate every aspect of society, and it's not the thing for which society exists, right? That's secular too, and that's what we normally think of with secularism. And the question is, what is the unthought of secular too about the decline of religion? Why did it decline? And here, what Taylor identifies is a sort of cascade of connected ideas. For the secular too, religion declining either because, yeah, that's the heater. That's water and steam moving through the system. Sorry. Yeah, it's still heating, so there's, yeah. So for the unthought of secular too regarding religion is that it must decline because either A, it is false, and science shows this to be true, or B, it is increasingly irrelevant because we can now solve many of the problems that we used to rely on religion for are now solved by science, medicine, understanding of phenomenon, you know, that sort of thing. Or C, because it is based on authority, and modern societies give an increasingly important place to individual autonomy, or some combination of those three, right? Either religion is false because, and science shows it to be, that's why it's declining, or it's just irrelevant either way because we have so much we can do with our modern technological society and everything we're able to do for one another and all the problems we're able to solve without any reference to God whatsoever, okay? That's a lived reality for many people. That's their unthought. Look at what we can do, and we didn't even think about God. Or this interesting one is the third. It's based on authority, and we value individual autonomy. And we're going to see that really come into play tonight as we see additional shifts within modernism up into our present moment. We don't like ideas of authority. We don't like ideas of clericalism. And oftentimes, our engagement with faith gets mixed up with inherited ideas of authoritarianism, clericalism, control, manipulation, and all these sorts of things. So it becomes the duty of the free-thinking modern person to cast off all of those shackles. And so religion declines. I don't need that priest to tell me how to live the good life. I can figure it out myself for me. And I have no connection to anybody else because I am the center of the universe. I've got main character syndrome, right? We talked about last week. So the result of all of this is it's a reductionistic account of religion. that can't imagine religion as a true motivator for human action. Religion in the modern era, in the secular era, is not a true motivator for large-scale human action in many people's minds. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm not saying that that's true for us. I'm saying that in the modern wrestling with God, in the modern wrestling with belief, many people are no longer motivated by their religious practice to do anything other than maybe kind of understand themselves a little bit better. But it's not the center of their lives. There are so many other centers to their lives, so many other options. Again, a proliferation of choices. And that'll also come up because choice becomes the great value of this era. So it reduces religion. It also reduces religion to what's called mere epiphenomenal beliefs about supernatural entities, right? Religion is just your beliefs about ghosts or elf princesses in the forest or God or saints or demons or supernatural entities. Religion is just the realm of the unseen, and because that isn't really something that science has much to say about, it must not be very relevant, so we just kind of forget about it and it peters out. And in many people's lives, again, they're so consumed with what's right in front of them that they simply stop thinking about it all. We can, it's been in the news here the past couple of days, many states are suing TikTok. And this is a great example of this. The essence of the lawsuit is that the parent company of TikTok engaged in deliberative manipulatory practices that assured that young people, children and teens, would spend all of their time in the app, obsessively scrolling and obsessively emphasizing, trying to find their own self-identity within TikTok. It's engineered to be addictive. And it's a great example of how easy it is in a reductive worldview about religion to forget about God altogether, because look, right here, this little dopamine factory in your pocket, this phone, gives you everything that you need, and it becomes a consuming thing. And, states are attempting to sue, and who knows where that'll go, and I'm not a lawyer, so I won't comment on that, but it's interesting. So epiphenomenal beliefs about supernatural entities increasingly disappear in the modern order. And this gets to a question I know we've addressed before. Sometimes people wonder, well, we hear all these stories about demons and demon possession, and we have scriptural passages about that, but why don't we see those things happening today? And the simple answer is we don't see them because we're not looking for them. And this is one of the things McGilchrist is going to show us as a neurologist, is that we tend to see what we pay attention to. And we tend to pay attention in particular ways based on our ideas of what is real and what is the given way things are. And so if we see what we look for and we find what it is that we hope to find, and the way we attend determines our field of vision and understanding, and all of which is to say that the world is still filled with the unseen spirits, and if you know what to look for, you can experience them empirically. This is part of the empirical dogmatics of orthodoxy, if you've ever seen any modern-day teachers use that phrase, empirical dogmatics or empirical theology. It's a lived experience, but it's a way of paying attention. That's the thing that has declined in the modern era, just because we have so many other things to pay attention to, and they seem so immediately gratifying all the time that we just don't think. This is why modest or moderate asceticism is so important for us spiritually. Constantly pulling the rug out of a worship of comfort so that we remember God, and attaching those practices to the remembrance of God, to the Jesus prayer. All right. So those are some of the unthoughts of secular to secularism. The decline of religion is happening because of those things. Now, there's obviously a counter-narrative, and Taylor puts himself forward as a Roman Catholic, saying that those are not his unthoughts. In fact, in his experience of life, those unthoughts are entirely unconvincing in terms of their ability to explain his life and how the life and how the world really works. All right. So some of what Taylor sees as a Catholic is he sees religion as a genuine, independent, irreducible motivator of human action and social life, not merely something arising out of economic or political or evolutionary patterns. So what that's referring to is this idea that sociologists of religion have, that the origins of religion are really sort of control structures as human beings move from being hunter-gatherers to farmers and built cities. Now you need religion and ritual to control the masses. This is Marx's famous line that religion is the opiate of the masses. So there's this whole idea in this secular two theory that religion comes later. That's why it's epiphenomenal. And it just emerges out of evolutionary concepts and serves as a controlling mechanism. And what Taylor's saying is he doesn't see it that way. He doesn't experience it that way. And we've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to rehash it. But what we have emphasized is that archaeology and the science of archaeology now is a little bit more on our side, although they're still trying to figure out what to do with it as they realize that elaborate ritual structures, temples were being built 1,000 years before agrarian society, the move from hunter-gathering to agrarian society and the building of cities. So it can't be the story, right? It can't be the unthought that matters. So he does find it to be genuine and independent and a motivator of human action and social life. The primacy of worship and ritual as a practice of meaning and communing, predating all these ideas. But also he emphasizes, and this is a key idea for tonight, that a transformational perspective is essential to religion. Transformation, or transfiguration if we prefer, is essential to a religious worldview, the way that we think about it and the way that we live it. In other words, God doesn't simply want me to do me here so that I can be happy all the time. God has a transformational calling upon my life so that my life may transcend simple human flourishing. Getting back to someone like Francis of Assisi or all of our astonishing saints who forego lives of comfort and privilege and indulgence in order to live spiritually. Transformation is essential to a religious perspective. The challenge, however, is that Christianity for so long was so associated with the existing state. And part of the whole story that Taylor has been showing us is the degree to which the transformational calling of religion was written out of the story. There is a God, he did create it, but he gave the world for us to use. And therefore we find happiness and meaning and purpose in this world the way we want to use it, not the way he calls us to use it. Right? So this is part of the whole separation of worship from the way we live, religion from the way we live. In fact, what Taylor says is religion is not just a set of beliefs or metaphysics or ideas of supernatural entities. It is a way of life. And that being so, it is a way of paying attention to the world as God's sacramental meeting point with us. And if we think about ultimate reality in that sense, in a daily dimension, we begin to see things we didn't know were there before. And this is the whole path of the saints. This is why we need the saints. Because otherwise we just see stuff and comfort and pleasure or pain. A religious way of life calls us to something more than mere human flourishing. It's the empirical experience of the ascendant and the divine, the unseen realm experienced as real and underlying the seen. Not just ideas, not just highfalutin hopes, but an actual lived reality that the unseen world reveals itself iconographically and sometimes quite directly to human experience if we know how to attend to it. And again, that word attend we'll be coming to heavily in the Gilchrist and the way our brains work, because it's really, really interesting how we can warp our ideas of the way things are simply by not understanding how we even visually see things and how our brain puts gaps together. That's fascinating. But we'll get to that later. The heart of secularization, Taylor writes, is the decline in the transformation perspective. Right? That's it. That's the world we live in. The heart of secularization is the decline of transformation. In other words, it's a rejection that God is calling us to self-denial, calling us to seek something greater than immediate human flourishing. That God, you could pray if you wanted to, but fasting, there's a reason underlying this whole story, for instance, that fasting simply disappears even before the Reformation as a lived experience in the Catholic West. That it went from being basically the same fasting rules that we had, if not a little bit more strict, to suddenly, well, just eat fish on Friday, and that'll be good enough. You don't have to worry about anything else. But the rest of it, right, that was all part of this long story where just attend to what's right here, right now. Fasting is something else. That's for those cuckoos up on the pillars, right? You don't have to do that. You just have to be a good citizen and make money, and money itself becomes the purpose of life, all right? So once God can be envisioned as real but wanting nothing more than that humans do their own thing, transformation goes and is assimilated into a kind of upward mobility, especially during the industrial and consumerist age. Any ideas that we have about transformation is really along the lines of, boy, if I hit the Powerball, imagine how my life would transform. Right? Imagine all the things that I would buy and all the things that I would do and all the freedom that I would have. And we all fall into this. It's a daydream that's very common. It's very typical. We assume that having a lot is really all about me and my comfort. Even if I think, oh no, I'll only keep 10%, right? I get 100 million and I'll give all the rest away. And it's just a little bit, 100 million, and I can still do whatever I want forever until I die. And then I can freeze my body and see if maybe it can be revived later. So Taylor attempts to show how his own unthought unfolds through three admittedly simplified but very, very interesting patterns of religious life in the three ages. In three ages, not the three ages, in three ages. So what he's after here is that he's charting another way of looking at a change of unthought or a change of mind that we can trace. And in this case, it's not from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern to the post-postmodern, but really it's once we hit the modern age, there's something that he calls the ancien regime, all right, or AR for short. The ancien regime, which is defined, it's essentially pre-modern religion, but the important thing is that aspects of it persist all the way up into at least 1800. And again, for us as Orthodox, it's still our practice, right? So it's not gone away. But broadly speaking, it changes its hold on people. And the ancien regime is simply this idea that there is an inexplicable link between religious and political identity. Church and kingdom are one thing, not different dimensions or different things. To belong to the church is to belong to the state, is to belong to your people or community, and is to have the structures around you that we've been talking a lot about that give you your identity from outside of yourself. All right, so that's the idea of the ancien regime. You are part of a layered, hierarchical, spherical world of meaning in which God and other spirits are present and active and revealing themselves. And that your identity is wrapped up in its one thing. It's religious, it's political, it's everything. Family, local community, right? The rituals that bind nation and community also conscript your individual identity. The things that you do to be part of the whole become a part of your identity. They conscript your individual identity and they give you that identity. So think of this, I don't know, I don't really understand parades anymore, and maybe parades would be a great example of this. When I was a kid, we would have a parade in my town for Memorial Day, and it was incredibly meaningful. It was to go to a parade or to participate in a parade as a civil action is to participate in something that's larger than the individual and that connects you to a grander narrative. In the moment that I'm in a parade, I become part of the ideals of the nation. If it's a Memorial Day parade, it's remembering those who gave their lives. It's the patriotism around our military, etc. If it's a 4th of July parade, it's the ideals upon which our society was, our nation was founded. And to participate in it is to say, this is part of me. It's an outside that gives me identity. All right, that's all part of the Ancien regime in Taylor's thinking. We all have experiences of it. Certainly coming to church is a great example of this, something we do together that defines us. So that's the Ancien regime. And what happens is we go out of the Ancien regime into what Taylor calls the age of mobilization, which he dates as roughly 1800 to 1960. Interestingly, 1800 to 1960. And during this time, a lot of what made that world the sort of magical, enchanted world that it was, and the holding on of religious forms from even earlier, all of that's simply wiped away, right? The old hierarchy is gone. We need to mobilize a new order with new rituals to take its place, and it depends on us. So this is the narrative within Taylor's argument of the transcendent shifting to the immanent in the age of mobilization. And let me just read a brief passage here to better give a sense of this. In the age of mobilization, there's no ancien regime we can take for granted, and no enchanted cosmos in which God resides and in which we are embedded. So religion and religious identity changes too. God is now present in his design or in his order, not in his temple in this idea. For us, it's still in the temple, but for generally speaking in the West, God is present in design and order. He will be similarly present in our polity, in our politics, or in our government, if we construct it aright, if we conform our constitution to the order God decrees in the heavens. And then he quotes Taylor, "The divine isn't there in a king who straddles the plains, but it can be present to the extent that we build a society which plainly follows God's design. This can be filled in with an idea of moral order, which is seen as established by God in the way invoked, for instance, in the American Declaration of Independence," right? So the very embodiment of the modern moral order, the Declaration of Independence, and the language of it. So this is the age of mobilization. God is still existent and we can believe in him, but we've got to make the world. We've got to create the great society, right? We've got to chase after all our multiple utopias and ideas about utopianism, okay? The third shift then comes in 1960, and he calls it the age of authenticity. And one of the follow-up books that Taylor writes is actually called The Age of Authenticity. So this is an idea that he develops further after he's written his magnificent tome, A Secular Age. The age of authenticity is the age of expressive individualism, and it is the age in which we live, right? Expressive individualism is the age in which we live. Each of us has to find his own way of realizing his own humanity against any notion of having that being defined from outside sources. Largely caused by the reason why he dates this from 1960, a couple reasons. One is going to be the sexual revolution, but before that even, it's the sort of explosion of consumerism and post-war affluence. The idea that this world can flourish gets kicked into hyperdrive in our society, in Western society in general, after World War II. And it becomes ever easier to forget about God when you have so much to buy and so much to get pleasure from, okay? This is where bare choice becomes the prime value, regardless of what it is you're a choice of. Choice is everything in consumerism. And the trick of a consumer culture is to always present the illusion of choice. Even if you're choosing what you want, they wanted you to choose. Choice is power. The idea of having a choice becomes very integral to our sense of whether life is fair and whether we're getting our fair share. Tolerance becomes the last remaining virtue. Everyone must have the freedom to choose their own way, to make their own reality, to choose what makes them happy, to chase after their passion, for instance. And therefore, all must tolerate each person's freedom to do so. And a lot of our debates today in the culture wars are between, interestingly to me at least, this tension between we're all kind of living this consumerist lifestyle, but we're not applying it in the same way to all dimensions of human being, okay? So the whole trend towards transgenderism is an extreme case of this, where the choice isn't just what cereal do I want to buy, I want 50 choices in the grocery store. That's a success, right? That's freedom, that's power, 50 choices of cereal. Or how many banks can we go to? Oh, that's all part of the choice of our landscape. But now I get to choose my own identity. I can even change my own gender, not because of my biology, but because we've gone into this before, but because the self is no longer located in something immutable, but in something that is constantly changing and constantly changeable. And because everyone deserves to have the same access to choice, then tolerance demands that we make it so, right? So it's part of the world we live in, and there's parts of it like that that we consider to be very pathological, but notice where it comes from. It comes from the same sort of cultural milieu that we're all living. We're just not applying it in the same ways. And that's why we end up not being able to talk to one another either, because we just don't understand how we're applying it. Some people criticize the age of authenticity as pure egoism, right? It's pure narcissism. And it's not. It's really the way that we're all living. It's us trying to define the good life and being trapped in immanence and trapped in choice and consumed by it. But we've all contributed to the state of affairs. We've all contributed to it and accept it as the cultural milieu in which we live. And again, consider how much we consider a benefit of all this. We like that we can go to Giant Eagle and look at the choice. Just mind-blowing if we could see that from the way that people ate in the Middle Ages to the choices we have in Giant Eagle. There's a story there, right? There's a story there of how we created a world in which that happened. It didn't happen just by progress, by the weight of gravity pulling us along, expanded knowledge and capability. That's part of the subtraction story that the secular two mindset teaches as part of their unthought. It's a construct. It didn't just happen because that's the way the world is or that's the way the world is supposed to be. It's actually a construct. So, a couple other things here, and then we're going to first, are there any questions? Everyone tracking with me so far? I'm hoping this still remains interesting. It hopefully is sort of overlapping a little bit because that's what Taylor does. He insists that we look at this in multiple angles. But okay, an example of this is fashion as mutual display and the transformation of our public self from a public being the way that we all engage in collective action to a public in which we all engage in various forms of mutual display. And fashion is, in essence, a cultural aspect of mutual display. Fashion is where we consciously or self-consciously adopt a look, which means we want people to look at us, and we want them to think something about us. I'm successful. I care about my appearance. I'm not a slob. I'm not, and we have to be careful here, but, we want people to look at us and we want them to think something about us. And this is a shift. This is a shift that he's looking at it from the aspect of fashion and the increasing sense of fashion, but public display becomes a form of virtue, influence, power, or avenue to wealth. The self-conscious individual is trying to present as a true individualist while also pleading, look at me, look at me, look at me. And we want to project our own self-image and self-identity onto the world, but we increasingly need that world to affirm us, right? And this is partly what explains what some people would call the oversensitivity of the current age that we live in. How quickly people are offended because they want complete tolerance and complete acceptance and complete affirmation of themselves. I want to choose my own me, and I need you to look at me and think good things and accept me. Otherwise, you're oppressing me. Just go to any school, right? This is college today. This is high school today. If you aren't fully accepting the self-image I project outwards, you're not accepting me, and that's an act of aggression. That's a microaggression, right? So this is where this is coming from. It's a shift in how we identify, how we situate ourselves as persons in public. We're no longer just hanging out with the people who know us and love us, warts and all. We're now constantly displaying ourselves and constantly trying to create an appearance and then making sure everyone accepts me. And I can't be happy unless I feel that everyone accepts me. So that's part of what all this is. And a lot of this, of course, becomes subject to manipulation by large corporations, especially fashion. I mean, fashion is a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's much bigger than just clothes and hairs and nail and glasses and whatever. Shoes are a big part of fashion. Corporations are trying to monetize identity within and through fashion and within these things. It's the construction of a consumer identity which has to feel like it's chosen and which trumps other identities, especially collective identities like citizenship or religious affiliation. All right. So this is the shift. I know I've emphasized in my own life thinking more and more about the two worlds that I've lived in, the Cold War world and the after the Cold War world, where there's a massive shift in identity in terms of who we are collectively because of the Cold War ending. And a massive shift then in the way that we as a country, and therefore me as a citizen, project ourselves onto the world. It's just totally different from when I was growing up to what it is today, or what it has been limping along trying to become essentially since 9/11. These are inflection points of projections of new identities in which our sense of citizenship is changing, and religious affiliation for many people has changed because the construction of a consumer identity is their everything. It's what they spend all their time thinking about. This is why they're on TikTok. TikTok is about the construction of a consumer identity. That's what it is. And the challenge here is that our brains work in certain ways and our hormones work in certain ways where companies can manipulate and engineer these things to bypass normal levels of restraint. And that's what we're wrestling with. Is it solved by a lawsuit? Is it solved by, reining in the Wild West of the internet and Web 2.0 and social media? We don't know, but we're struggling with it, and we don't know what AI is going to do to all of that. Yes, John? Yeah, I think so, but I think in different ways. And I think some companies have tried to take responsibility more than others. I think the lawsuit is right now against the TikTok parent company is really because it's so egregious. It's here's 8-year-olds, we're going to get you addicted to our app. You're not going to be able to look away. Like they meant to do it. I think all the algorithms do this, but the difference is whether or not we just didn't realize it was going to do that, or we realized it in a certain way. I just saw an interview the other night. This doesn't give me hope, but it's not an interview. It was a program on AI, I think that's on Netflix, and they were interviewing Bill Gates, and they were talking about whether or not reining in these implications. We don't know. This is the problem. We sort of let something like Facebook out into the world as a general idea of let's unite everybody and then we'll figure out how to make money off of it, which is exactly what they did. And they didn't realize that by connecting the dots, they would create something that was potentially so much a manipulation of reality for people. And we don't know what AI is going to do, but what doesn't give me hope is that Bill Gates said, hey, we've learned our lesson on the internet. We thought that getting all the information of the whole world onto the World Wide Web so that anybody could access it at any time would simply expand knowledge and expand. I don't know, I'm sounding like Bill Gates there. Expand knowledge and expand our ability to construct a better world. And whoops, that didn't work out because it turns out that too much choice in relation to what we're talking about here, too much choice overwhelms our capacity of discernment. And it turns out there was a reason why we had curated knowledge for all those centuries and millennia. We don't need all that choice. We get a warped view of reality. So I think this is the challenging time that we live in, is that a lot of these things that Taylor is identifying, and I think in many ways these things are happening in real time now. After this book was written, they're simply taking the trajectory and going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, if you will. But yes, I think all algorithms are based on this basic idea because algorithms assume that every person is a consumer unit, right? The whole purpose of an algorithm is to give you more of what you want, so you spend more time so that they can charge more ad dollars, and it all comes down to money. So they're manipulating our attention for the sake of profit and using strategies and methods to do that. Once we know about them, we can make choices. No one makes us get on Facebook. No one makes us get on TikTok. But at the same time, can a 10-year-old who goes to school and everyone that they know is in that world, can they get out of it that easily? Can parents get their own kids out of it that easily? That's sort of the cultural moment that we're in. Here's another example of this. At the start of school, in September here, there was a commercial on TV for Target, and it's about a 10-year-old boy. He's walking through Target. Did anyone else see that? And he goes, Mom, Dad, you know how last year I was all about dinos, right? Dinosaurs. Some of you are nodding. You saw this commercial. It was dinosaur this and dinosaur that. He had a dinosaur backpack. All his shirts had to have dinosaurs on them. He needed a dinosaur lunchbox. He needed dinosaur toys, all which, by the way, are things you can buy at Target. And he goes, but this year, it's all about sharks. Dinos are out. Now I want sharks. Sharks, sharks, sharks everywhere. Sharks are my identity for this school year. I need a backpack with sharks on it. I need a lunchbox with sharks on it. I need t-shirts with sharks and toys and posters in my room. Notice that it's a very interesting thing. All things you can buy that, in Target, but it's the construction of identity. Who am I? I am a person who loves sharks and will buy products with sharks on them. That's what it means to be a human being. And then, who do I relate with the most? Other people who also like sharks and want to talk only about sharks all the time. Right? This is preposterously stupid. It is a shocking reduction of what it means to be human. And yet, it is the air we breathe. It is this idea of construction of a consumer identity is everywhere. And it's very hard to escape. We all have our toys now. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we all have our toys. Yes?
Thinking about identity and AI, I was on a board meeting on Zoom last week. And you know how sometimes people will put a picture of themselves up because they don't want to go live? And so someone commented on the one photo and said, oh, that's a very nice photo of you, this person. And she said, oh, that was generated by AI.
Oh.
And you can send AI a bunch of photos and it picks
Right.
the best you.
Right.
And she said, now
Right.
I'm aspiring to look exactly like that.
Oh, Lord have mercy. Yeah, and that again is the construction of an identity based on norms, which are no longer the norms of become like Christ, become a saint, right? But look a certain totally unrealistic way and now spend all your time and money transforming your body to look that way. And notice again the normalization then of everything from weight loss to cosmetic surgery to you've got to constantly be manipulating your look to present yourself in public. It's all about mutual display, right? That's the age of authenticity. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Right. And I think this is scary because, we started doing this to ourselves long before we had AI, right? And this is the whole part of the sort of age of media where we display only the most beautiful, only the most ideal form. Of course, the Greeks and the Romans were doing that too. So let's not, it's always part of human society. But this idea of having cultural ideals, but then using technology to create an expectation, we're all going to look like that. You know, we're all going to look like Michelangelo's David. Not realistic. Yeah. Hmm. Sure. Possibly, yeah. Um, my sense when I started telling that story, I said I'm not very hopeful based on what Bill Gates said because I don't think we've learned a darn thing about our mistakes with the internet, right? Because I think that is an underlying that whole idea of instead of curating knowledge so that we can make the right choice, we said let's just put an avalanche of knowledge out there and equalize the world. It is part of a philosophy of egalitarianism. There's no one keeping the library anymore. There's no guardians at the gate. We all have equal access and we can use it however we want. And I don't think there's any indication that we've learned the lesson that this has really polluted our world in terms of what we think is real. That's my concern. Can AI help us? Possibly, but that's beyond my pay grade. I'm not. But you're right, and here again we can kind of push back on this and say, look, we're probably going to benefit tremendously from AI, but we could also, this whole concern now is, but we don't know who's going to put the brakes, and if something can be done to use it to make more, even at the expense of most, they will. Even if we enact laws here, it will be used somewhere else on the globe in bad ways. It's the same thing, how much of the internet is used for criminal activity now. It's a complicated thing. It's a complicated thing. But let me end just with a couple of things for tonight. For many young people, certain styles, oftentimes adopted from stars, singers, internet personalities, what we call influencers now, which is exactly what it sounds like. They are those who influence style and self-appearance, self-image. Styles occupy a bigger place in our sense of self, and that this has tended to displace in importance the sense of belonging to large-scale collective agencies, nations, churches, political parties, etc. So that, again, that is part of the age of authenticity. My style is me. And that's the most important thing. I actually think this is what is turning, though. Even since Taylor wrote this, I think that some things have gotten broken in our minds and in our culture where we realize, boy, this feels really shallow. And I jump, this year it's dinos, next year is sharks. When do I get tired of putting on different personalities? When do I get tired of only relating to people who share my same ideas and same interests? That's not what community is built upon, right? Community is not really built, not historically speaking, community is not built upon shared interest, which is what Web 2.0, the social media sphere promised to give us. Won't it be great? You don't have to be friends with people who annoy you and don't share your interests. You can only be friends with people that you choose, and it's left everyone lonely because it's a false idea of what community is. Yes, Irene? Yeah. Mhm. Orthodoxy returns us to a completely different relationship with God, with each other, and with the world in such a way that we can see better the false turns that we've taken. Right. Even as we can admit that we still benefit from a lot of it, if not most of it or a lot of it. But, yes. But orthodoxy and thinking about these things as Orthodox Christians helps us understand there's nothing about the Orthodox faith that follows these patterns. Yeah. Well, this is why I think they're coming back. This is the turn, I think, is I think it's early to tell, and I'm not trying to prognosticate about, there was several years ago, there was prognostication that we are in the middle of a third Great Awakening from the perspective of cultural evangelicals in America. And then that turned out to not really be the case, but that's still kind of in the background. There's something going on there where I think there's a recognition that instead of a lot of the secular two worldview implies an enormous sense of optimism of what we're going to build in the future. And I think that's one of the things that's changing is we're not so sure that's true anymore. Even just with all the threats of climate change, and I mean, in an hour or so, the next hurricane's going to hit Tampa Bay. Maybe that has nothing to do with climate change. Again, I'm not, but there's this idea hanging over us like the world is rebelling. What we did to the earth, we're now paying a price. There's not a lot of optimism. You might feel it, but ask anyone in their 20s. Are you optimistic that our cultural civilization is moving in a positive direction? There's a broad sense that it is not. We are fragmenting into trillions of individuals with their own, each with their own lived reality. And it's making us all crazy. Right, right, because you're more than that. Not only is secularism a reduction of religion, it's a reduction of what it means to be a human being. That's the key. And this is where I've insisted many times that the great error of Western Christianity was making worship essentially irrelevant to life. It was a toss away. It's something you did once a week. You did your duty. You moved on. That was it, right? I've got a great quote about that here in a moment. But yes, Manishka.
For example, we have St. Simon the Stylite, who's praying all day on his hands and knees, saving the soul and making those of others.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's worker bees
Mm-hmm.
that build this beautiful temple that we can hopefully feel the grace of God when we're here and pray.
Mm-hmm.
If we were all Stylites, this would not have happened.
Right. And I'm not suggesting that we should all be Stylites. But what you're describing is secular one. Right? Well, it is. It's simply the way the world has been. But the original sense of secularism is that there are people who plow the fields and grow the food and make the clothes and make the cloths that we eat and the utensils and do all these things for our flourishing. And there are also people dedicated to prayer all the time, and that this is part of a contiguous whole. They're all part of a cosmos of values, right? So absolutely, that is what the whole Middle Ages that was what civilization meant through the late Middle Ages. The revolution is the breaking of that symphony. That's what Taylor's really describing. So it's not a question of we should all be this or we should all be that. In fact, it is precisely the resolution of those tensions that characterizes the modern age in Taylor's accounting for things, right? that we want to live where maybe my job is I'm an auto mechanic, but I'm saying the Jesus prayer all the time, and I'm trying to fast while I work hard. Well, that's hard, and maybe I can't fast as much as a monk in a monastery, but I'm still thinking about it, and I'm still doing what I can do relative to my strength and my life situation, right? That is a pressure, though. There's a tension. We as Orthodox Christians are used to living with that tension, and it's an important part of what it means to be Orthodox. But what Taylor is really describing is that in the Western world that we live in, they decided we're canceling that tension, right? We're going to say, no more fasting for you. Why don't you just focus on human flourishing? And it becomes an either or. Either you're all about God or you're just about this world, but you can't live in the tension of both, right? So I think that's an important part of our lived experience of being Orthodox in a world where we specifically came in order to flourish better in terms of material things. We have to keep that tension in tension, right? We don't want to resolve it and say, well, no, I just don't have to do anything because I've got this job and it's really hard. Or I'm really stressed, leave me alone, I'm eating a steak, which we do. I mean, that happens, but yes. Right. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Taylor acknowledges that thoroughly. He's really describing this as a lived life here in what we call the West. And what he means really is the Germanic states, Scandinavia, England, Canada, United States, the sort of Anglo-Saxon world. And remember, the Saxons were Germans, essentially, right? So that's the world we live in. But absolutely, there's a recognition that many places that we typically call the third world are thoroughly enchanted still. But the goal of globalism is to end that, right? The goal of globalism in many ways is to so interconnect economies so that there's this condition of mutual benefit that no longer has room for that enchanted world. And this is The World is Flat book. What's that? I would say the Orthodox world is, yeah. More so in a place like rural Russia or Siberia. But still, I think this is part of our calling, is that we bear a worldview and a way of being, a way of living that is still very much vibrantly enchanted. Again, if we're careful about the way we're using that word, filled with the reality and experience of the unseen. And that's part of our mission. That's part of the thing, is that a lot of people are living in such a flattened world of immanence that they realize, like, this isn't working for me, and I need something more. And they're not finding that in other forms of Christianity because they're going and they're finding the disenchanted world, right? Go up to Orchard Hill. That's a completely, thoroughly disenchanted world of rock and roll and emotion. That's what that is, and it's deliberate. I mean, I'm not criticizing them. I'm just simply stating the fact that this is exactly what they meant to do as a way of trying to get you back with God, but through a disenchanted avenue. Yeah. Do I see another hand? No. Okay, I do want to finish. I don't want to keep you too long. We're almost done. Yeah. Let's see. Do your own thing. Who am I to judge? That becomes one of the credos of the age of authenticity. Everyone is chasing their own passions. Tolerance, this is an interesting point. Tolerance has always been a central feature of the modernist imaginary, even back amongst Enlightenment thinkers. Tolerance, the toleration of religions in a new state like the United States of America, built into our Constitution. The difference, however, was that tolerance used to have a scaffolding of other intact structures: civic responsibility, school identity, something like the Boy Scouts, which deliberately sort of connects you to a sort of ideal of who we are as a nation, or Girl Scouts, our church, of course, clubs, There was scaffolding around us that tempered our sense of tolerance, but much of that scaffolding has folded under the ascending weight of individual expression. Now the only thing that cannot be tolerated is intolerance of everyone else exercising their choice. So what's the place of the sacred in all of this, in expressive individualism? Just very quickly here, and then we'll wrap up. So first of all, under the dispensation of the ancien regime that we've described, which the world was still contiguous, my connection to the sacred entailed my belonging to the church, and the church is coextensive with society in such a way that there is a link between adhering to God and belonging to the state. Here's a great example of an artifact of that for us, is the fact that there's an American flag up on the emblem, right? Okay, so some of you are wondering, why is that up there? For this, right? Because to belong to the church is to belong to the state. And for a certain generation, that is sacred, right? People have left the church. If the dean makes the mistake of moving that flag from there to like the corner, yes, we're Americans, but does it belong up on the emblem? Liturgically, it does not belong on the emblem. Absolutely not. But to a certain generation, they were so proud of that to move it was a death knell. They would leave the church. That's a good question. But this is an artifact of the ancien regime. To belong to the church is to belong to the state, and there's no separation. Touch my flag. Hey, man, I went to Korean War. You better not touch that flag, because I bled for that. In the age of mobilization, there has been disembedding. Instead of belonging to the church as the same thing as belonging to the state, we see the emergence of the denominational imaginary, the emphasis on voluntary association. You join the church of your choice, right? That's part of the proliferation of choice in the modern age. You're still connecting to something bigger, but it is this idea of the church of your choice. This is my style of Christianity. And you get that with people who go church shopping, right? People go church shopping, they're looking for what speaks to them. So they become the arbiter of what the church is supposed to be, and they project their own identity upon that church identity. But now, in the age of authenticity, with its expressive individualist outlook, we have a qualitative shift. The religious life or practice that I become part of must not only be my choice, but it must speak to me, it must make sense in terms of my spiritual development as I understand this. The expressivist forges her own religion or spirituality, her own personal Jesus. And what's most significant is that the sacred is completely uncoupled from political allegiance. They have no connection whatsoever, right? So that explains a lot of people's attitude towards religion and spiritual things, and why we still have a proliferation of spiritual options, but a decline in actual religious practice in our society. Let everyone follow his or her own path of spiritual inspiration. Don't be led off yours by the allegation that it doesn't fit with some kind of orthodoxy. Right? That's the age that we live in. And so really what he concludes is that what draws people away from traditional institutional religion is largely the success of consumer culture. Well, we have to stop there. There's a whole nother section here that I think is really important. We're going to do one more session on Taylor. And again, if you want to keep thinking about these things, please buy the book. It's really good. But think about it as an Orthodox Christian, because I think that's the most important thing. He's describing a world that's still very much the Western world. And what I hope to do next week is to really draw in a lot more of our Orthodox experience in the way that we're wrestling with what these are called cross tensions, and try to give some illumination to, okay, now we know this story, we can see it, we can see artifacts of it all over cultural aspects, which I did last week, where I just pulled different ways that I encountered these ideas just out of random sources. But we have to deal with it as Orthodox Christians, not as oh, we're kind of like that Catholic tailor, just without the Pope. That's not the point of this. Because we are the enchanted world in a good sense. We are the sacred sacramental world. We have a mission to a world that's suffering because of its vapid disenchantment. And therefore, we have to spill out paradise and welcome in the wounded. And that is the mission of the church. And it is found nowhere else but in the core aspects of our liturgy and our spiritual ascetical life. So we'll connect those dots next week as we finish up with Taylor and then move to McGilchrist and look at all this from a slightly different angle and keep layering it together. Okay?